As part of National Sprinkler Week, I'm joined by Alex Hill, Managing Director at Whitecode Design Associates, and Tom Roach, Secretary of the Business Sprinkler Alliance. And we're going to be talking about National Sprinkler Week, the key theme being how we can highlight the critical role that sprinklers can play as part of a package of fire safety measures, and focusing on the importance of getting more sprinklers into schools to limit both the societal and economic impacts of fires in educational establishments. And along the way, we could dispel some myths about sprinklers. So let's introduce you, first of all, to our guests. We have Alex Hill, as I said, Managing Director at Whitecode Design Associates. He's on our left, a qualified specialist engineer. Alex has more than 30 years experience within the building services industry, with a wealth of knowledge spanning all sectors. He will provide insight into why sprinklers should be installed within educational buildings. We also have Tom Roach, Secretary of the Business Sprinkler Alliance, otherwise known as the BSA. Tom is a senior consultant within the International Codes and Standards Group, or FM Global, one of the world's largest commercial property insurers. Tom works to share FM Global's knowledge and expertise to influence building codes and loss prevention standards. Now, with the intros underway, let's pop to the questions. And the first one is on guidance, and I can direct this at you, first of all, Tom, as Secretary of the BSA. Could you clarify what the guidance is for sprinklers in schools across the devolved nations?
It's a very good question. So if we take it from the top, in Scotland, the provision of sprinklers in new and extended schools is actually in law. It's part of their building regulations. Come down to Wales, they use something called Building Bulletin 100 like we do in England, although they control the provision of sprinklers through funding. So part of the business case for a new school in Wales is sort of predicated on the basis that there'll be sprinklers in the new school. Crossing to England, we use something called Building Bulletin 100, which does have provision for sprinklers, but actually it doesn't sort of mandate the use of sprinklers. And so we shouldn't be surprised to see that sort of in England, we're really seeing very low percentage of schools being constructed with sprinklers right now. And that's gives you a snapshot of what's happening across the devolved nations.
Do you know what sort of percentage is in schools in England that have sprinklers?
Looking at the fire statistics, it would say that roughly about 2 to 3% of schools in England have sprinklers, and of new build schools, 1 in 6 is provided with sprinklers in England.
And what's your views on that? That's obviously too small a figure, would you say?
I think we've got to sort of step back and look at, if we look at Scotland, Wales and England, what was the sort of rationale behind putting sprinklers into those schools, or the idea of thinking about, giving guidance on sprinklers in schools? It was to protect education and the premises so that, kids could go back to education as quickly as possible. And that's a good thing, in my opinion, and something that we've sort of lost in England, where we've sort of gone over to thinking about school as almost being disposable, back to sort of thinking not about the protection of that school, but we need to make sure the kids get out, which is absolutely the thing we should do. But school itself, we're not thinking of the resilience of the school thereafter.
Can I put that question to you, Alex? Your clarification with guidance of sprinklers in schools.
I think cost is a driver. Working for most of the major construction companies and clients alike, if something isn't mandated, then it has to be a decision within the team as to whether it can be afforded. And it is a shame that, schools are a very high risk item. That there are often, arson attacks on schools, and we've all been aware of those. And, I think school is such a limited resource, it should be protected. And so that if there is an incident, it's very localised. It's too easy for a school to disappear and all of those students to be displaced. That, for me, leaving it to a building bulletin is not really the right approach. And realistically, this should appear within the building regulations in approved document B, and it should be mandated, in my opinion.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Having listened to teachers talk after fire events, and I'm particularly minded of a teacher from Wales whose school was sprinklered, what I found fascinating was she told me about her school and the fact that it wasn't about losing the whole school, it's about losing teaching space. Lose one teaching space, that's not good. Lose two teaching spaces, that's difficult. Lose three teaching spaces, her school became unworkable. And I'm sort of sitting there thinking we've got to think about that in terms of the education of the children, in terms of what is that impact. And as we saw last year with 3 schools in Derbyshire, the kids have been displaced from school for a long period of time. We know schools have been disrupted because of the pandemic, but that disruption, the add-on disruption of the fire and disruption of displacing kids from their normal surroundings makes education very difficult, not only for the children, but also for the teachers.
I suppose the important thing to say is that, you know, if we just take a standard construction of a new school, if a school was to be completely destroyed by fire, you know, we're talking about, you know, a minimum of a 2-year reconstruction program, probably with 6 months worth of, you know, demolition and design. You know, we're talking about potentially ruining an entire child's secondary education by displacing them into a completely different school. And I think that risk is, you know, for me on a design team, I'd be saying to the client, can you afford that risk with this new school?
Just to put a bottom line on this question, Tom, you said that the percentage of schools in England was something around 3% that have sprinklers used in existing buildings. Do you know how that figure compares to the rest of Europe, for example, in schools across Europe, the continent?
Sadly, it's quite similar for the rest of Europe. I think the challenge, though, I think is one of the things we have to applaud Wales and Scotland, and actually when Building Bulletin 100 was put in place, is the foresight that said education is important. We need to maintain educational stability for the benefit of the children going forward. And I think it's one of those places where, again, I'm looking at Wales and Scotland and saying, why is it they're taking a lead, and in England we're fudging it? It is my thought, particularly based on the importance of the education.
Absolutely. We'll go on to the second question now, which is about the impact of fire. I'm going to put this one to you, Alex, if I may, first of all. The fire safety guidance has a focus on life safety, but would you agree a fire's impact is far-reaching?
Yeah, as I said to you, you know, it doesn't matter what the building is, the effect of not just the fire, but the method to either prevent the fire or tackle the fire. You know, quite often, even with sprinklers, you know, there is a need for the fire brigade to extinguish the fire. The damage that causes is not localized to where the fire is. You know, particularly on a building more than one story, you know, generally the damage caused by water far exceeds the localized issue of fire. Now, the benefit with sprinklers for me is that generally it is quite localized. It's a low level of water. In most cases that I'm aware of, there isn't a huge need for any dampening down because the building is sprinklers. You know, what we want to try and do is avoid, you know, the fire getting out of control in any way, shape or form, and the fire brigade needing to use what will be thousands and thousands of litres of water, because, you know, in a school environment that's more than one story, you could potentially take out the rest of the school, even if the fire in itself was attended quickly and it was localised. You know, the disruption there is, for me, is far-reaching.
Yeah.
Tom, your thoughts on that?
I'm in total agreement. My belief is if we protect the school, you know, using active fire protection like sprinklers, we're also protecting those people within it, whether it's children or people who go there to enjoy that school for extracurricular activities, because we've got to remember schools are hubs in a community. A lot more things go on there than just education for children. There's a wider part of the community. And I'm very minded of, I sat and listened to a parent yesterday whose children, you know, saw their school destroyed, and they're in the midst of that disruption. 3 weeks after the fire, they're still working from home. It then takes several months while they're displaced, i.e. from their friends to other schools in the local, you know, area. And now they're sort of in a temporary school, sitting on the sort of the land where the school used to be, and they're projecting, just as Alex said, we're looking at sort of 18 months before that school will be finished, and they'll be able to sort of decant out of this temporary classroom structure back into a new school. And I think we've just got to remember that it's not a case of like a business where suddenly you say, well, I've lost my warehouse, there's another one up the road, I'll just move in, put some racks in it, and I'll try and make my business work there. This is real disruption for education and the children.
I suppose the other thing to mention is that, temporary enclosures and temporary structures, they're not the most comfortable environments. I am aware that schools do have quite a few buildings, but we know if your environment is not comfortable, you are less likely to learn. If it's not warm, if it's not the right humidity level, it's not ventilated well, it's not comfortable, you just don't want to be there. So it's important that, particularly where we've got a new school, where all of that has been considered, we protect it. For me, it's short-sighted not to do everything we can to protect that infrastructure.
As a child of the 1970s who grew up being educated in a mobile sort of caravan style environment, I can vouch for you on that. It's all about the environment that you're learning in, and if it's not comfortable, then you're not going to get the right results, really. And that's the most important thing of all, isn't it? Safety, comfort lead to better learning experience, etc. The next question is about maintenance for you, Tom. First of all, what are the fire safety issues for schools when they are refurbished and expanded?
Okay, I'll put my loss prevention hat on here. Unfortunately, I've seen too many times when a school is undergoing refurbishment or extension and fires occur. The most typical one is a roofing fire that occurs on a roof, and it's due to poor practices basically by contractors. So for me, when it comes to thinking about that, got to think that when a school is being extended or refurbished, it's a time of high risk. There's a lot more risk brought onto site to do that extension, that maintenance, and it needs control. So whether that's by somebody externally coming in to manage contractors and make sure the right practices are in place, or by somebody from the local authority, it needs to be done to sort of minimize those hazards. And if a school is sprinklered, one of the key things is not to switch the sprinklers off just because maintenance is going on. Only turn off the bit that really needs to be done for that period of time and get it on as quickly as possible afterwards. Unfortunately, I've seen too many times in other industries where a sprinkler system is switched off and then something bad happens. And if only for the sprinklers being on, it would have been a small incident. With the sprinklers switched off, it becomes slightly larger. So again, I think it's that message is maintenance refurbishment is a time of high risk. There's more hazards coming onto a site. They need to be carefully managed and thought about.
And to you, Alex, I mean, obviously, in the design sector that you're in, how would this? What's your thoughts on this? Fire safety issues for schools when they are refurbished and expanded. What's your experience of that?
I think sometimes schools very much have a very limited pot of money, and that the body of work that they often do is quite piecemeal, and they can't be afforded quite the level of management that often is required. I've seen numerous schools, my old grammar school, having roofing works, and it is a very dangerous time in a timber-clad building. And for me, if we were doing this in an occupied residential building where we were doing hot works, we'd have fire wardens, somebody whose job it was to raise alarm, to check the practices, and to deal with any issue quickly with a defined plan. Quite too often I've seen and heard of buildings where where there's a fire occurred, those people have evacuated, the small fire hasn't been tackled, and the whole building's come down because of it. And again, I think management, a plan, and very well trained operatives, which don't always align with the funding arrangements that schools often get. They often get a lump of money. They've got to spend it by a period of time. It's finite. It can't move, and that doesn't always breed the right approach for me for property protection and actually other people's safety. You know, quite often these schools are occupied when there are guys on the roofs with torches. You know, for me, it is a time of risk, as Tom says, and I think we're very good in the UK in managing risk, but only if it's properly managed and it's a proper team, and that isn't always available to those schools. And I'd like to see that change.
So it's as much about planning, foresight, as much as it's about funding or lack of funding, really.
Yeah, I think, you know, the old adage of, you know, having a plan you know, planning for every eventuality when it goes wrong. You know, if something goes wrong and it goes really wrong, then you didn't have a plan. You know, for me, a fire plan, okay, we've got hot works on the roof. What are we going to do with a small fire? And what is the plan? How and rehearse it. You know, rehearse it. Too often a fire occurs, it isn't dealt with, there isn't a plan, and it gets out of hand. You know, a small fire can be dealt with locally with local extinguishers. It can be. But, you know, I was on a roof the other day with a guy at Hot Works. There were no fire extinguishers around. I spotted it. I told the site agent. The guy wasn't even using gloves. There are still people out there, even on a well-managed site, who will take a risk. You know, he's got Hot Works. He needs an extinguisher. He should have gloves on. He's tipping bitumen onto the roof. You know, for me, you know, that building was 10 stories high.
Yeah, I think one of the things I learned very early in my career was I never thought we needed, you know, documents and checklists as much as we do in the world of fire. But something as simple as a hot work permit, which at the top basically asks you, do you really need to do this hot work? Could you do it another way? And ask those simple questions like, do you have a fire extinguisher within, you know, so many meters of you? Have you got a blanket that you can sort of put over to sort of shield anything that needs to sort of be, you know, shielded from the hot work? All those sort of things are precautions that we'd expect, but as Alex is pointing out, we don't always see.